to get an idea of what a specific learning disability is. Okay, so we'll start with this one. And this is a term that you're likely to see now on IEPs, that a child has been diagnosed with a specific learning disability. So what exactly does that mean if you see this show up on paperwork? So what we're talking about with SLD is a specific learning disability in reading, which really we can just call dyslexia. This is just another name for what we know as dyslexia. And about 80% of all learning disabilities are dyslexia. It's a reading difficulty. And we're going to talk mostly about dyslexia today. Other specific learning disabilities are dysgraphia, which is a difficulty writing, and dyscalculia, which is a difficulty in math. And between the three of these, we're talking about around 15% of all children. So, you know, in just about any classroom in America, you're going to find a few kids that are affected with a specific learning disability. So this is very common, very prevalent, and very important for us to speak about. Okay, so dyslexia in particular is an unexpected difficulty learning to read despite intelligence, motivation, and education. So we're talking about something that it's not cognitive. So we're not talking about a child who, you know, has difficulty learning in all areas. Okay, we're talking about a very specific difficulty in just this area of learning to read and spell, perhaps with writing and handwriting and areas that involve literacy. Okay, so it's not a problem with motivation. We're not talking about students that are lazy. Certainly that's not a word that would go along with any dyslexic child I know. They're usually the hardest working kids you've ever met. And it has nothing to do with their education. So we're not talking about children who have not been formally schooled. Okay, those things would sort of, we wouldn't make a dyslexia diagnosis for a child who, you know, fits any of those categories. So we're not talking about a cognitive delay, and it exists on a spectrum, right? So we have children who are mildly dyslexic, students who are severely dyslexic, and everything in between. So to be diagnosed with a specific learning disability, we would see one of the following at least. Sometimes you see multiple difficulties, but we would see a difficulty with reading, comprehension, spelling, writing. If we're talking about dyscalculia, we're talking about math calculation, math reasoning, but their skills are far below what we would expect either for their age or their grade. These difficulties would begin in childhood, okay? This is often hereditary. So one of the questions you would first want to answer if you're working with a student with dyslexia, if you're a parent of a child with reading difficulties, you're going to be asked, is there a family history of this? Is there a grandparent or an uncle or a sibling who also struggled learning to read? That's often a huge red flag. Again, we're not talking about an intellectual disability. We would want to rule out any sort of like vision or hearing difficulties, neurological conditions like pediatric stroke. You know, it would not be due to any of those things. So it's a really unexpected difficulty. All right, we don't know why this is happening, and you know, the student is able to do all these things, but reading seems to be a real struggle. It wouldn't be due to like an environmental or an economic disadvantage. Like I said, lack of instruction, or if it's an English language learner, we would want to rule out all of those things. All right, so that being said, if the child's not learning to read, then we're probably talking about dyslexia, and they're likely to be diagnosed with a specific learning disability in reading. Okay, so those two things mean the same thing. All right, so why does this occur? So speaking is a really natural process. Man has known how to speak for thousands of years. At this point, we're like evolutionarily wired for speaking. So it would be almost impossible for a child to avoid learning how to speak. Okay, if they're exposed to language, they're going to talk, barring any sort of really severe disability or, loss of hearing, things like that. This is not true of written language. So we haven't had written language for very long, considering how long man has lived on Earth. We've had written language for about 5,000 years. And if you look even sort of more recent history, like 200 years ago, the literacy rate worldwide was like 12%. So, this is not built into your brain. There's no innate inborn mechanism that you use to read, that the brain just is born knowing how to do this. We don't have that wiring from birth, okay? And as a matter of fact, the brain is not naturally wired for reading. We have to use other parts of our brain that are meant for other things, and we have to kind of force connections there to make reading happen. So it's kind of interesting that our brains are not set up for this at all, and the parts that we need to read are quite far apart in the brain, and so to make those connections, it really needs to be taught, okay? And for a lot of kids, it needs to be taught in a very specific way. So this is why we see students really struggle in such great numbers. I mean, it really is a pretty prevalent disability. So what we find, and most of the research here comes from functional MRIs, we know that kids with dyslexia are not using the same parts of their brain as kids that are really good readers when they decode text. So you can put kids in an MRI machine and ask them, do these words rhyme? You can show them words and patterns and see which parts of their brain are working. And we don't see the same thing when we put a child with dyslexia into this machine. So, in the last 20, 30 years, we know an awful lot more about dyslexia than we did before. So we know exactly what their brains are doing. And we also know what works to help make these connections. So very quick, I just want to kind of go over what your brain is doing so we have a good understanding of that. And then this will kind of lead into some of the questions about how to help these kids that are not reading easily, okay? So one way you can think of this, and here we're talking, the image on the screen here is, this would be like a child who's a pretty strong reader who has made those connections. We would see activity in 3 parts of the brain. One way to think about this, if you make like the I love you symbol with the sign language I love you symbol and kind of put it on the left side of your brain, that kind of helps show you where these 3 areas of the brain are located. So where your pinky is, sort of right here behind your temple, is it's called the phonological processor. So this is the part of the brain that processes speech sounds, that would take in information sort of auditorily and process it and help you figure out what the person's saying. Where your thumb is back here, sort of in the back part of your brain on the left side, that's the part that processes symbols, and specifically here letters. We would really like to see a lot of activity back here when kids are reading, because this is also where words get stored for like long-term storage in that orthographic processor part. We don't see a lot of activity back there with kids who have been diagnosed with dyslexia, unfortunately. So they're not using that part of the brain to read. They're relying on other parts. You can see that these 2 parts of the brain are pretty far apart, and there has to be a connection between the 2 in order for reading to happen. So this part that's sort of here in the middle, it's kind of behind your ear, where your pointer finger would be if you're making the I love you symbol. That's connecting the letters to the sounds. Okay, that part of the brain, we would like to see some connection going on there too. What we often see with unskilled readers is that they light up really heavily in the front, and oftentimes on the other side, on the right side of their brain, we see activity. And really that other side of the brain is not really associated with reading in the brains of very strong readers. So, they're kind of using these parts that they may be able to read, but it's going to be slow, and it's going to be laborious, and it's not going to sound fluent. Nothing is happening automatically. They're really overusing parts of their brain, like that phonological processor, to try to make sense of what they're seeing, as far as the symbols on the page. You might see kids that sort of read it under their breath a lot. That sort of subvocalization is happening because they need to hear it in order to process it. So they're really overworking this phonological processor. So the good news is when we have a student who's maybe not using all the easiest parts of their brain to read, we send them off to, you know, Orton Gillingham or some sort of really scientifically based remediation for maybe a year, and we bring them back to the fMRI, and suddenly we see that those connections are starting to be made. So we actually can rewire a child's brain using these really best practices for teaching kids how to read. So the research is so exciting and it's so interesting, and I love to talk about this because it's really amazing what we're able to do now with the science of reading, which we'll get to. But this is the basis of all of that. We need to know what's going on in the kid's brain and how do we force those connections. So, you know, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, that is the work of those years. We have to make sure that those connections are being formed, because third grade and up, they're learning other things, you know, how to understand what you read and analyze, form opinions, retell. Those are, you know, the connections are no longer being made, okay? And so we know for sure if somebody does not help the child make these connections, they're not born with these connections, they have to be forced. If it's not happening in a really specific, systematic way, some kids are not going to learn to read that way. It will always be difficult. So fortunately, we know how to solve this problem now. Okay, so here's our first submitted question, and it's a really good one. What programs or curriculums fall under the science of reading, and how do I know my child's school follows this? And this is the science of reading. It kind of feels like a new buzzword, and other things have been happening in American schools for a long time. Now we're coming sort of back to basics with what we kind of always knew. You know, if we talk about reading instruction, maybe a century ago, it looked a little bit more like this, and we got away from it, and now we're coming back. So it's not a fad. Hopefully this really is science that's here to stay. So when you hear science of reading, it's not a program, it's not a curriculum. The science of reading is that body of research. So how do humans learn how to read? We've been studying this for many decades. And what we know is that humans best learn to read in a way that's really explicit. So everything, that code has to be taught. Okay, kids are not going to learn it innately. It's not going to happen like through osmosis. It's not going to happen, you know, it's great to read to your kid a lot, but that's not going to be the only thing that needs to happen in order for kids to learn how to read. Providing them with lots of books and having, you know, giving them time to sit and read, that's great, but they need to be explicitly taught the code. Okay, that's really the only way this is going to happen. Sequential, meaning that we want to teach one thing at a time and use the things that we've already taught for practice. So we don't want to give them things to practice with that we haven't taught yet. That's also kind of a key here. This kind of instruction is really systematic. It's prescriptive, diagnostic. So we're doing a lot of assessing and making sure that we're teaching things that are not yet automatic, and it's very cumulative. So we're always building and reviewing and looking at what we already know and adding the next little piece until we get all of the pieces together to make reading happen. All right, so this kind of teaching involves really intensive phonemic awareness and decoding training. So this is a piece that we kind of got away from a little bit in the last several decades. And the reading rates in America, we know, are, they have not been good. So, you know, when we move away from teaching kids phonics and the actual sounds that the letters make, then we move away from actually teaching them how to read. It's not something they're likely to pick up on and really understand innately. So we really need to involve those kind of things and give them opportunities for practice reading controlled text. So you'll hear me talk about some of these kind of things a lot. So phonemic awareness, we're talking about the idea that words are made of sounds, and those sounds can be manipulated. We can break words apart into smaller pieces, and we can count the number of sounds in a word. We can maybe change the middle sound in a word and make a new word. Okay, those ideas are things that a child would really have to know before they even learn to read. Okay, they have to know that words come apart. Decoding and phonics, we're talking about the symbol and sound correspondence. So looking at the symbols and knowing what sounds they make. So they're two different things, but they're similar. And then when we talk about reading controlled text, we're talking about only giving them things to read that we've taught them how to read. Okay, so controlled text is really important here. We don't want to put a book in front of them that they're not ready for. There wouldn't be too much value in giving them a book if they can only read 50% of the words. So we want to be careful about what we're choosing to expose them to for reading practice. And then, we know that teaching whole word memorization is really limited. Okay, so there are some curriculums that will work on, just like drilling words, and we're going to send home this list of words for you to learn, and the kids sometimes will be able to memorize them and spit them back, and they're really just sort of memorizing them at sight, and they're not really learning why the word says what it says. That's really limited, how many words a kid can kind of keep in their brain that way. So it's really not a good way to teach children how to read. So, they can memorize maybe in the hundreds of words, but that's not going to take them very far. We know that we need to give them the code because, by fifth grade, they're encountering like 10,000 new words just in that fifth grade year. So if we're just memorizing words at sight, that's not really a sustainable strategy. All right. So they have to learn to decode. So here is an example. If a child memorizes 10 words, that's great. They can read those 10 words. But if we teach them the sounds of 10 letters, we get this really exponential effect. They can read, thousands and thousands of words that way. So 353 sound words, 4,324 sound words, 21,655 sound words. Some of the families that I just began working with strategies for learning, it's amazing. I'm only on like maybe the 8th session with a couple of my new students, and you can make hundreds of words with 8 sounds. So you get a couple of vowels and some consonants, and you can mix them up into just thousands of different words. So it's really fun to see how the kids can kind of put them together, use them for spelling, use them for reading. You can start really small and quickly build their reading vocabulary that way. So science of reading, it's a collection of research. It's not a curriculum. Orton Gillingham, multisensory reading, these terms are a little bit interchangeable. They're approaches to teaching reading, okay? And they're based on that science. So when we talk about something like structured literacy or Orton Gillingham, multisensory, those things are all kind of in the same realm, okay? But we have to use that brain research that we so recently have gathered, all right? And that's really the best way to teach children how to read. All right, so what does structured literacy look like? How do we teach this? All right, so we see that there are many, many different things that a child needs in order to become a skilled reader. And this is a diagram that's often used in teacher training. So we kind of look at all of these things that need to be sort of wound together for a child to be able to actually do the work of reading. And you can see that there's going to have to be a lot of different kinds of lessons going on here almost simultaneously, and bringing in all of these different skills for the child to be able to actually achieve this fluent execution of reading. So we know that Orton Gillingham is like it's the gold standard as far as these sort of evidence-based structured literacy approaches. And it's using all of the research of how children learn to read. It's teaching all of these things in a really explicit way, very systematically, very diagnostically and in a really cumulative way, so that we're just building all of these little pieces to get the child to where they need to be. The instruction needs to be really assessment driven. So we have to see which of these pieces are weak, and so we can strengthen that reading rope. And why do we teach this way? Well, we know that there are 5 really essential components to reading. And structured literacy is going to incorporate all 5 of these. So the big ones are that phonemic awareness part, where we're talking about the sounds that the letters make, and that these words come apart into smaller parts. The phonics part, where we have phonological awareness, we have knowledge of syllables and sounds and the symbols that go with those sounds. That all has to be taught really explicitly. Fluency, the ability to read in a way that kind of sounds like speaking. Vocabulary is a huge piece here. If the student doesn't have the vocabulary to support the text, then they're not going to be able to make sense of what they're reading. All of those comprehension pieces, the red part of the rope there, that all has to be taught really explicitly as well. All right, so students who have difficulty decoding, they need to focus on that for automaticity, both for real and nonsense words. So, there's some practice there where we're working on decoding even non-words. So if we kind of make up words that follow the patterns of English, the child still should be able to decode those things. So there's an awful lot to this, is I guess what I'm getting at. A lot of things here that may not be covered in depth in the classroom. Those may be missing pieces for some of our students that are struggling a little bit. There's a whole field of morphology where we're learning about little parts of words that have meaning, like suffixes and prefixes and roots, and those things are really necessary for comprehension. Again, it's not really an innate skill for a lot of our students. So, we want to keep that in mind, that those things should be really explicitly taught. All right, things to watch out for. Anything that's called balanced literacy. This was kind of a buzzword in the last couple of decades. Balanced literacy is not a great way to teach reading. It's giving young readers unfamiliar texts and then asking them to rely on strategies that are not things that good readers do. Okay, so look at the picture. What do you think that word could be? Or maybe skip over that word and see what word might make sense there. And so these are things that poor readers do, and balanced literacy often kind of teaches kids to use these strategies that we see unskilled readers using. So that's kind of a word that I would watch out for if your school is using balanced literacy, or you kind of get a sense of it. Any program that's encouraging children to use pictures or guess a word that would make sense, skip the word and come back to it. Those are not strong reading education curriculums. Anything called 3-cueing, it's kind of the same idea. You're asking the kid to use the semantics of the sentence, or pick a word that makes sense. What does it sound right? Those are not teaching the child the code. Okay, they're not asking the child to look at the symbols there in front of them and match them to the sounds. All right, so these are not great strategies. I have an example here that my own daughter, she's in 2nd grade now, but last year this was on posters all over her classroom. And it's very real. We see this in classrooms everywhere. Asking the student to look at the pictures to read a word, or to skip over the word and then reread the sentence, or just ask for help. I mean, they're not giving the child the tools to really break that word apart and say, okay, I know when I see these letters together, it sounds like this. Okay, and we've seen this before in these other words, and I've got a keyword that's going to help me figure out what these symbols will do when you put them together. So anything that you see like this in your child's classroom, it would make me just ask, like, what, is this how you're teaching a child to, attack a known word? Because there are better strategies than this kind of thing. Okay. So what we know is that 95% of students can learn to read if we're using these science-based strategies. Okay, with just about any of these programs, 30% of kids are just going to take off. 50% of kids are going to need that really explicit direct instruction. And if the program is not offering that, you're going to see a huge chunk of the kids just not be able to really become strong readers, unfortunately. And keep in mind, we've got kindergarten, first and second grade. That's the window. Okay. Beyond that, those third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade teachers, they're not teaching this code anymore. Maybe a little bit, but that's really not the focus. We've got 15% who might need a little extra assistance, and 5% who, unfortunately, if they're severely cognitively disabled, they may not really get it. Okay, but 95% of students is a pretty good goal. All right, so we really want to see these stronger science-based programs being used in your child's school. All right, so our next question said, what are the common signs of a learning disability in reading? What should parents be looking for to determine whether their child may have a learning disability when it comes to reading? That's a great question, and it really depends on the age. So we've got, for all ages, again, you're going to see likely a family history of reading problems. There'll be somebody in that family tree that had trouble, all right, somewhere. When my uncle was little, he, it took him forever to, he can read, but it just wasn't his thing, right? So you'll always hear that sort of, there was somebody in the family that struggled with this as well. Phonological difficulties, we'll get to that in a little bit. Trouble breaking apart sounds, rhyming words, things like that at all ages. But aside from those two things, you're also going to see this, we call it the sea of strengths. It's this really interesting thing that happens when children have the brain that's, working on both sides and, not really able to put the sound and symbols together. They also tend to be incredibly curious, really great imagination, reasoning skills like off the charts. They always kind of see the big picture. They've got these huge spoken vocabularies. They're great puzzle solvers. They're great like building things, Legos. They have all kinds of really intense talent, right? They have great verbal comprehension. They're like little experts in things, and we see that across all ages. Okay, there are a lot of very successful dyslexic adults, and across fields, scientists, doctors, you name it. Okay, so it's just an isolated problem with those phonological difficulties. Okay, so that's true of any age. In very young children, we would notice some things like a speaking delay, but it's very subtle. You're talking about, just kind of a little bit late with the first words and making phrases. It's not a huge difference, but it's a little bit noticeable. You would see some like baby talk up to maybe around the age of kindergarten. You hear words like Piscetti instead of spaghetti. They're just not kind of spitting out those sounds in the right order all the time. Unable to identify rhyming words, that's a big red flag. Difficulty learning names of letters, especially the ones in their own name. These would be signs that maybe when they get to kindergarten, they might struggle a bit. So to that, we would add, if the child is maybe a little bit older, by kindergarten, first grade, we would expect them to kind of know that words come apart, especially by first grade. They should know that, if I have a word like cat, that's not one chunk, that's 3 different sounds that are blended together to make that word. So they should start having that sense by kindergarten, first grade. They should start matching letters to sounds at this point. If they can't do that, that's a big red flag. We would see a student who's really struggling have sort of these egregious reading errors. Okay, they're making wild guesses. They're mixing up words in a way that makes no sense. If they're not able to read consonant, vowel, consonant words like cat, then we have some concerns at this age. These children complain about reading a lot. It is hard. They're seeing their friends just kind of start to get it and do it, and it's not happening for them. So this is something that really is beginning to become a struggle around kindergarten, first grade. By second grade, all of the things that I already talked about, you would say, yeah, that happened when they were in kindergarten, first grade, but also now we're having a hard time mispronouncing longer words. We get a lot of even their speech, they're like searching for the right word. They can't quite find the word that they're looking for. Dyslexia at its core it comes with a real struggle with memory, working memory issues. So trouble remembering things that they were told, directions and things they might want to hear a couple times. We're still seeing like really wild guesses while they're reading in second grade. You might see difficulty with small words. That's actually pretty common. Things like was and saw might be getting mixed up a lot. Even the really simple words, you'll notice they might skip over and just omit words like is and or they might be skipping over really important words, and the sentence makes no sense, and you're thinking, how aren't they catching the fact that what they just said made no sense? They're substituting words kind of in a really wild way. Certainly these kids by now would have a fear of reading out loud in their classroom. That would be something really terrible if they were called on to read. We often see really messy handwriting with these students. Those two things kind of go hand in hand. We start to see really low self-esteem at this point, because by second grade, most of the kids in the class are probably reading. All right. So if we're not reading yet by second grade, that's really going to start to affect their how they feel about themselves. Definitely spelling and reading go hand in hand. These kids, unfortunately, may never become really great spellers, but by second grade, you're seeing real struggles with like the weekly spelling tests and things like that. They need a lot of extra time to get their homework done. You'll notice that they use really imprecise language like stuff and things when they're telling a story. All right, young adults, we would see all of those things that we talked about before, as well as like this, difficulty remembering names of people and places and things, a struggle to kind of retrieve the word that you're looking for. They might avoid words that they don't want to mispronounce and use other words that are not as precise. Certainly a lack of reading fluency. Reading would make them very tired. Still really poor spellers, unfortunately. Even with remediation, spelling is always going to be a bit of a challenge. And they often need a lot of extra time. Okay. So those are sort of the warning signs. All right, this is a great question. How important is a reading disability or dyslexia diagnosis? Should I get my child assessed? And if so, what type of assessments are available? This one really depends. So assessments are really expensive if you're looking to get one outside of school. I've seen parents charged up to $10,000 for a reading disability assessment. I would ask, will it change anything? Are you already getting extra help in reading with like a really knowledgeable clinician, or, is this going to change something at school where maybe the school is denying that there's a problem and, you need a diagnosis to get an IEP for the extra time? If it's going to change something, then yeah, it's probably going to be worth it. If the funds aren't there, then I would suggest that you probably just spend it on remediation, because it's pretty easy to know when a kid is dyslexic. There's not really any other reason why a student who's being instructed in school and has good attendance and otherwise is cognitively, very intelligent, and there's no other problems. If they're not learning to read, it's dyslexia. I mean, there's not really anything else that it would likely be. So finding somebody to remediate that can also be expensive. So if you have to choose between one or the other, I would say probably get outside help, because the help that's offered in schools is not always that's not always the best way to go. They don't always have people in schools that are really well trained in this, unfortunately. So if you do go the diagnostic route and you find a neuropsychologist to perform a assessment, you would probably see tests of decoding and fluency and spelling and comprehension. With young children, you usually often get some sort of IQ test to go along with it to make sure that cognitively the child is able to do all kinds of other things. They won't usually do that with adults. It's enough to say, oh, well, you finished high school, or you're taking college courses. Obviously, you're not super cognitively delayed if everything else is normal. But for young children, we don't know, so we have to kind of rule that out. One really important test that they'll definitely give if you're looking for a dyslexia diagnosis is the ability to read nonsense words. It's called a word attack test. So if your kid cannot look at a nonsense word and sound it out, then we know they're not using the code. A phoneme deletion test is also, something that they'll probably give your child. They'll say something like, say the word sure, but don't say shh. And what word are you left with? Or, okay. So these kind of tests, there's a whole bunch of them. It's not one test that's going to give you that diagnosis. But it's a worthwhile assessment if you need it for help at school. What are the different types of evidence-based reading programs, and how do you determine what is most appropriate for the student? Good question. So Orton Gillingham, again, is the gold standard. It's not a program, it's not a curriculum, it's an approach. So it's a set of principles and practices that somebody really well-trained would be using to teach a child how to read. There are a lot of programs based on Orton Gillingham, but they're not all effective for all students. So Wilson is one that shows up in a lot of schools. It's very scripted. It's Orton Gillingham based, and it's multisensory based. And for a lot of kids, it's really great. And for some children, it is just too quick. Okay, so as written, if you don't have a teacher teaching it that can make those adjustments, it might be way too fast. I remember when my daughter was doing Zoom kindergarten during the pandemic, I watched her teacher do one lesson on THCH, SHPH. It was all in like 45 minutes. And it was, I don't know, like 5 digraphs, which to me would be 3 weeks worth of lessons for a student who's struggling. And she taught them all in one little block. And some of the kids were really lost. So, and she wasn't doing anything wrong. It's just some of these programs move quite quickly. And if you don't have the teacher at the helm that has that knowledge to sort of break it down and slow it down when it needs to be slowed down, it's not going to work for some of those kids. So much more important than which program your school is using is who is the teacher. It's got to be somebody that's really well trained and can sort of adapt and adjust when the kids aren't getting it. Okay. Is there any structured reading program for special needs kids? There are a ton of them. Here are some of the more popular ones. They're all based on Orton Gillingham, but again, it's, they're not one size fits all. If you're not sure if the reading program is based on, anything scientific, you can ask, is there scientific evidence of how effective this program is? Not testimonials, but like peer-reviewed journal articles. You can ask the administration or the reading specialist at your kid's school. A lot of these programs are reviewed by the National Reading Panel. That's part of the National Institutes of Health. You can get some information on it there. You want to make sure it's systematic, explicit, phonemic awareness and phonics based. Okay. Ask how the children are taught to approach an unfamiliar word. Are they told to skip over it? Are they told to look at the picture? We talked about that earlier. Those are not great strategies. They have to learn the code. You want to make sure it's individualized, that they can sort of base it on the need of the child in the class, and lots of assessment is needed there. All right, how do I advocate for my child to receive extra support? So you need to be really kind of fearless with this. If your child is really struggling, you have to go in there sort of fearlessly and be ready to go up against some of those people in the school. And if you're not the person to do that, if that's not your personality, you can find professional advocates. There are people in my county that do it for free. There are organizations of people like that you can bring with you to the meeting and sort of fight those fights. Don't ever agree to retain the child to repeat the grade. That's really not helpful. Don't agree to wait and see, let's see what happens after Christmas break, or let's see what happens by the end of the year. these problems are persistent and time is of the essence, especially when your child is young. List your concerns, speak to the teacher, get really specific information. What are you doing to help my child, and what has the progress been like? And if there's no progress, then okay, what else are we going to try? Because something that failed the first time is not going to work the second time. Okay, so, go ahead and visit the class, so tell the teacher you want to come in and see your child in a reading lesson and see what that lesson looks like, and, have all of that information about what it should look like. And then you can have those discussions with whoever you need to at the school. How do I best support my child with dyslexia? I love this question. So first, you have to know that dyslexia is a lifelong thing, that the help is going to look different at different points in their life. It doesn't look the same for a young child as it does for an adult. Certainly, you're going to have to find a professional to remediate the phonologic weakness. This is not something that all schools have. Okay? There's not always a professional there that really knows how to do this. It takes a long time to learn how to teach this way. And unfortunately, teacher preparation programs don't include this training by and large. They may start to going forward now that we have really been talking about this as a nation, the science of reading movement. But historically, teachers from my generation have not been taught how to do this well. It's really complex. Don't try to be the kid's teacher. Okay, you have to leave it to a professional. You can definitely ask the teacher, how do I support what you're doing in the classroom at home? If they are really good at this, they'll be able to give you tons of ideas. Your biggest job here is to figure out what the kid is really, really, really good at and push those strengths. Okay, you have to make sure that you're finding somebody to help them with the reading stuff. But if your child is gifted in engineering or computer coding, or has a real interest in medicine or biology, you have to find opportunities for them to really grow in those areas, because most of the time dyslexic kids are geniuses at something. So we have to make sure that we're really working on that thing. And listen to your kid read aloud. We know that this, reading difficulties are more common than anything that they're going to be checked for at the pediatrician's office. So, you wouldn't put off like bringing them to their checkups. You have to listen to them read often, so you can really kind of monitor yourself and see if they're getting better at it, at least a few times a week. All right, here's a quick one. How do I find a balance between reading materials that are interesting to my child but appropriate for her reading level? There's a whole bunch of publishers that do this. This is not an exhaustive list. You want to search for high-low books. That means they're high interest, low level. This is just a sort of a quick snapshot of some publishers that do this. Librarians are really good at this. They'll find books that we call them controlled readers. So, you're not going to encounter words in there that you're going to have a hard time reading. All right. And then these last three questions that were submitted are very similar. What can I do to help my kid become a better reader? Read with them, listen to them, listen to them read, choose the books really carefully, make sure that they can read, we want them to be able to read at least 19 out of 20 words accurately. If they can't do that, the book is too hard. It's going to be frustrating, find a different book. Believe in them. They are trying and working really hard. They're not being lazy. Reading is really hard when you're not using the correct part of your brain to do it. They can do it, but it's just exhausting. It's really, really hard. It's a real brain difference. So we have to know that and believe them. You get them back after a full day of school, they're probably exhausted. So keep that in mind. You can help them discover patterns in English. You can play little word games with them. Try to make it fun. I'll put on cards words like pin and tub. And then I've got a little magic wand with an E on it, and I'll put the E at the end, our little magic E, and oh, the word became pine. Oh, this word became tube. And why did that happen? And what happened? Which letter changed? And let's pull the sounds apart and try to find little word games that you can play. Definitely be their advocate, show up, meet with their teachers. You can make demands of the school. They they really have to do something to meet your child, where they are by law. They have to provide certain accommodations and things. And just remember that that instruction that failed the child once is very likely to fail them the second time around. Work on their vocabulary, listen to audiobooks, don't read to them so that they're getting access to all of that really advanced sentence structure and vocabulary that comes with the higher grades. You can research words together. You can say, hey, look, all these words end in ology. What do they all have in common? Let's think about that. What do you think ology means? That chunk must mean something, right? And then once they kind of figure that out, oh, what do you think zoology means? What do you think? You can talk about words like that. And just remember, you don't have to be the teacher. Sometimes you have to find a different teacher from the one that they have in school, but you're there to offer support. You're there to really, really, push the child in the direction of their strengths and make sure that they're really getting that part from you. So whatever they're really good at, really focus as much, if not more, attention on that as you do remediating the difficulty. And I think that's just about all of the advice that I have for these three last questions. I would love to take some other questions if there were any.
Let's see. Let me pull up some additional questions. So for
Sure.
those who are here, and if you have questions you would like to ask, you can actually go ahead and do so using the chat box. There's a little icon underneath the screen. You can go ahead and type in your questions into the chat box, and then Stephanie could go ahead and answer those for you. I do have a few questions that were submitted sort of late. And so maybe I'll go ahead and ask you those myself. So we have a question from a family who is asking about graphic novels. She says that she has a child that would not read except for graphic novels. Is this okay?
Oh yeah, my daughter loves graphic novels. Reading is reading as long as you're practicing the code. So, make sure those graphic novels are, appropriate for the level that the child is at. Make sure that the words in there are, decodable. There shouldn't be a whole lot of irregular words in there. I know some of the graphic novels get a little complex. So those might not be appropriate. It depends on where the child is, but that is a huge shift that I've noticed in the last decade or so, that graphic novels have really, they've really made this huge leap, and I see them everywhere now. But yeah, absolutely. Reading is reading. All right. So if they like that format, then they're still getting the practice. You can practice fluency. Sometimes the pictures, you can act it out together, or you can practice, reading with expression. Graphic novels are great for that. Absolutely. I see one in the chat there. Can you recommend any books that directly teach Orton Gillingham method? There's a very good book called Multisensory Teaching of English Language Skills, I believe. That's sort of my handbook. In terms of the best book about dyslexia itself, this book is sort of the be all and end all. It's a really exhaustive source of information for, yeah, this book is great. Sally Shaywitz is, she's definitely like one of the leading experts in the world on this topic. So this book is great. It has a lot of information in there, not necessarily about teaching Orton Gillingham, but just, how the brain learns to read. Certainly if you're a teacher and you're looking to get Orton Gillingham training, there are a lot of great programs out there, and there are some that are not so great. So you're not looking for like a 3 or 5 day workshop on Orton Gillingham. It's going to be a real course with a lot of hours, and it's a lot of work. All right, so a certification course with like a practicum, you would want to see where the professor is actually like sitting down with you and you're teaching model lessons, and they're giving you feedback. It's not an easy thing to learn how to read, or to learn to teach how to read. I know a lot of the programs out there, like when I first started teaching, I remember I got certified for one of the Orton Gillingham based programs that my school was using. And I think it was like maybe a 5-hour workshop after school. And they told me that I was certified to teach it. And I thought, okay. And that first year of teaching, I don't think any of my students really learned how to read. They differ. And so, you really want to find out what that training entails, and look for something that's a little more involved, because this is really it's a lot learning how to teach this way.
Yeah. Stephanie, I have, I guess, one last question.
Sure.
Is a family asked, does frequency make a difference in terms of, working with like a truly Orton Gillingham, practitioner?
Yeah, I would say, I always tell my students at least twice a week. And from there, it depends on how quickly you want to move. So, twice a week, you're normally going to see quite a bit of difference after a year or so. But if you wanted to cut that down to, maybe months, then you might want to go for 4 or 5 days a week. Certainly you would a lot more progress in a shorter period of time that way. So it's, often that's just a monetary issue. This can be really expensive. So that's up to the family. But if you can afford to go 5 days a week, you would see some good progress pretty quickly, I would imagine, with most students.
Well, actually, we have one final question. Malik asks, do you recommend Speechify? It's a textbook audio reader.
Absolutely. So do not shy away from audiobooks or computer programs that read aloud to your student, because just remember what they're being asked to do if they're in 5th or 6th grade. If they're not there yet, then they are completely missing out on that vocabulary, the sentence structure, everything that goes along, and they're just going to fall further and further and further behind. So audiobooks are amazing. If you can get an accommodation that all their textbooks are provided as audiobooks, do it, because it's not cheating. That's how they're going to learn, because after 3rd grade, they are expected to read to learn. And if they can't read it, they're not going to learn it. So something like science or social studies, they're not going to get much out of it if they can't decode the words. So while you're working on that remediation, they may not need that accommodation forever, but absolutely, if they need it, give it to them. That's not like a cheat code or anything to give them a book on tape or to give them a recording of the text. Absolutely read it out loud to them if there is no such recording, because that's the only way they're going to be exposed to it. All of a sudden, when they hit 5th or 6th grade, the sentences get complex. You're talking about sentences with more clauses and they're harder to comprehend. You have to keep working on that. Even if they're not able to read it themselves, they have to be able to be exposed to it. So absolutely, I love any software that's going to help make that easier. We want to make everything easier for them. That this is a real struggle. So don't ever assume that a child that's not a strong reader is being lazy. That is, if I can give you one piece of advice, it's try really hard not to get frustrated with them, because it's a very real thing and it's super common. And you can just go ahead and assume that your child's brain is not really doing what your brain would do when they're looking at the same text. So, try not to get frustrated. It's something that, they're going to get there. They need to be taught in a different way, probably, from what's happening at school.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. I think this just about concludes our time together. And I know some of you may have additional questions. So you're welcome to send me an email. And we can schedule a consultation. We can try to answer those questions for you. And then we're going to have a recording of the presentation available for those who want to review it, or you want to share with someone. You're welcome to do that. And then lastly, we know summer is just around the corner. So if you have a child or know somebody that could use summer as an opportunity to really help overcome those academic gaps and some of the learning loss from the summer slide. And you need recommendations for, whether it's with us or whether it's through another program, and you need recommendations for, do you think this is a good program for us to look into? We're happy to help with that. So you can send me an email as well. But thank you all again. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I feel like I learned so much from this presentation. I'm sure a lot of our attendees did so as well. So thank you. And we hope to do more parent workshops like this in the future. And so we hope that we'll see some of you there again in the future when we have more opportunities like this. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Take
Great
care.
questions.
Bye, everyone.